The Hario switch is a brewer that is capable of marrying the clarity and sweetness of a traditional V60 with the body and structure of an immersion brewer. At least that's the idea. But striking that balance in a way that is truly satisfying to me is something that I've always found to be a challenge for one reason or another. Over the last few months though, I've settled into a recipe that I believe delivers complexity, juicy sweetness, and a pleasant body for just about any coffee that I've thrown at it. If you're unfamiliar with the switch or steep and release brewers, I want to give a little background. But of course, if you just want the recipe, chapters are below, so feel free to jump ahead. Usually the first thing that you see with the steep and release brewer is, well, literally just that, steep and release. You add all of the water at once, let it steep for a few minutes, and then release it. It tastes pretty good, but it loses some complexity, and I think it also puts a pretty hard cap on how much coffee you can make at a time based on the brewer's capacity. But the Hario switch, perhaps due to the V60's reputation as one of the more technically demanding pour-over brewers out there, as well as a brewer that often rewards that effort that baristas invest into it, has invited loads and loads of experimentation and innovation in regards to how the steep and release mechanism is used. One of these innovators is Tetsu Kasuya, whose hybrid method provides the starting point and inspiration for the recipe that I have been using pretty much daily for the last couple of months. I'll link his video down below in case you haven't seen it already. Essentially, this recipe moves the steeping phase from the beginning of the brew to the very end. So we start off with percolative brewing and end with immersion brewing. This way, there's more fresh water moving through the coffee in the first couple minutes of the brew when most of the extraction is happening. It's generally my understanding that the first 2 minutes is the time where more acidity and volatile compounds are most available and easy to pull out of the coffee. Percolation is used first because it's more efficient. The water hitting the coffee is always fresh and therefore a better solvent because it hasn't taken on any soluble material from the coffee. In contrast to during the immersive phase, the brewing water is sitting and gradually takes on more and more soluble material, over time effectively resulting in what I kind of think of as a more gentle extraction, or really just a less efficient extraction. But that doesn't mean that immersion brewing is not good. If you've ever cupped coffee before, which is a type of immersion brew, you may have experienced the coffees getting sweeter and sweeter as they sit on the table well into 20 to 30 minutes after brewing. Those coffees don't over-extract or become bitter, at least not usually, and in fact sometimes the opposite is true. These coffees, having been left to gently brew on their own without disturbance, taste incredibly good. And I get that this is a little bit subjective, but it is for sure a shared experience among quite a few coffee people that I know. So this recipe, using the hybrid method as a starting point, is my attempt at capturing that sweetness that you get on the cupping table and marrying the best of percolative and immersive brewing using the Hario switch. We're starting off with 25 grams of coarse ground coffee, ground coarser than a typical V60 grind at least, and water at about 95 degrees Celsius. We'll eventually arrive at 400 grams of water total for a cozy 1:16 ratio. The first pour is 150 grams, poured into the middle with a small circular motion, something like an inch or an inch and a half in diameter. I usually will swirl the bloom even if the coffee isn't that gassy, which helps to level the bed and slow the flow of water. And you might not even call this a bloom considering how much water is used, and I'd be okay with that. I like to start the second pour at about 50 seconds to 1 minute. The second pour will go up to 275 grams, then pausing until about 1:50 or 2 minutes for the final pour. This is probably a good time to mention that I'm using Catholic medium filters for this recipe. I almost never experience stalling with these, and while they aren't required for the recipe, they certainly make it a lot more consistent. Once 400 grams is reached, I will flip the switch and let the remaining water and coffee steep for about a minute, aiming for a total brew time of 4 minutes to 4 minutes and 30 seconds after the drawdown is complete. It's okay if the brew ends up taking a little bit longer, but I don't really notice much difference or improvement past 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Interesting enough, once I have this recipe dialed in, it's quite resilient to changes in batch size without adjusting my grinder setting. Assuming I keep the ratios the same, I found that 250 ml batches and 500 ml batches work just fine, as long as the pouring pattern is roughly proportional to the dialed in recipe. But instead of adjusting the grinder, I simply add or subtract time from the final steeping phase to achieve 4 minutes to 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Which means two things. One is that flavor profiles across batch sizes are very similar, and two, I can use the grind setting to primarily manipulate flavor without worrying about total brew time, drawdown time, etc., which is so not the case if I'm going between 250 ml and a 500 ml batch size on a regular V60. Essentially, I feel a lot more confident in being able to make as much or as little coffee as I need without having to think about it too much. As someone who does coffee for a living in a cafe setting, I love tinkering and tweaking with recipes as much as anybody. But I also really love to have a recipe at home that I can depend on that can just essentially be on autopilot. And for now, this is that recipe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.